There are several different related concepts that are involved in interpersonal attraction. In this slide, you can see that we're talking about love versus like versus lust. Lust, of course, is sexual desire, a physical attraction to another person. Love is a deep caring about the other person and his or her well-being. And like is just you find the person rewarding to be around, you enjoy their company. And these three things are related, but they're quite different. So in this set of PowerPoint slides, we're going to try to distinguish loving from liking. And yeah, we'll talk about lust a little bit as well. Let's focus first on the distinction between love and liking. For quite some time, researchers, as well as most people, I think, thought of love as a lot of liking. They were essentially the same thing, but if you really, really, really liked somebody, that meant you loved them. But we now know that loving and liking are quite different animals. They're very different responses based on very different things. One of the primary things that separates them is love has a very strong biological component that liking seems to lack. On this slide, you see all kinds of words for neurotransmitters and hormones and other chemical things that are going on when a person is feeling attracted to somebody in a love-lust kind of way. And these things are not operating when we simply like somebody. So the first distinction is that love has a much more biological event than liking is. You don't need to remember any of these specific things on this slide. Just remember the basic principle that love does have a chemical component that liking lacks. A perhaps oversimplified way of stating the relationship between your physical state and love is that adrenaline makes the heart grow fonder. And think about lots of different examples of how this works in day-to-day life. One of the standard letters that you see written to advice columns comes from a male who might describe himself as nice guy in Toledo. And the letters always go something like this. The letter writer describes himself as a perfect gentleman who has great respect for women, who treats them well, who bends over backwards to be a good companion, and yet time and time again, women dump them for the bad boy. And what is the matter with women for being attracted to these scoundrels when there's a perfect gentleman right there who's interested in them? And whoever's writing the advice column usually replies in the appropriate way, nice guy in Toledo, just be patient. Your soulmate will come along eventually and people will recognize your good qualities. But what they never say is the problem here may be that the nice guy in Toledo is just as boring as shit. I'm sure many of the women he dates thinks he's nice, they like him just fine, but they don't have that feeling of attraction. So one of the things you don't want to do if you're looking to have people lust and love in your direction is to be boring. And that's where adrenaline comes in. The proposition is that romantic attraction for another person is attributed to oneself when you experience a heightened state of arousal in the presence of this person and you attribute your heightened state of arousal to that individual. In other words, you get excited and then you draw the conclusion that the excitement is due to this other person. This idea has been around for a long time. Ovid, who was a Roman expert on love, wrote a manual where he advised young men about how to win the women of their dreams. And one of his bits of advice was to take the woman to the gladiatorial contests. The idea being that if she's sitting there watching all of this gruesome stuff, her arousal levels are going to be high, her heart's going to be beating, but she may interpret this as attraction toward the young man that she's with, and therefore find him much more desirable. Shakespeare, in his play Romeo and Juliet, used the interference of parents with the love relationship of two young people as an example of the heightened arousal levels coming from the parents interfering causing the people involved in the relationship to be even more strongly attracted to each other. We now even refer to the Romeo and Juliet effect. It's a thing that the more interference there is by parents, the stronger the feelings of love expressed by the couple involved. And there undoubtedly is some dissonance reduction going on as well. If you see yourself going through all this grief just to be with this person, you resolve your dissonance by saying, well, I must really love him or her. There have been several fun experiments that demonstrate this effect and how it works. In one case, male subjects in an experiment who were sitting around waiting for electric shock expressed more attraction to a young female Confederate that they met while they were waiting for the experiment than another group of males who were not waiting for electric shock. Waiting to be shocked, of course, raises arousal levels, and this transfers, it seems, to the person that you're meeting. In a similar study, male subjects were sitting around waiting to have blood drawn, and the experimenters really played it up. They had people in white coats walking around with little vials of red stuff that looked like blood, so that they were constantly being reminded that they were about to have blood taken from them. And once again, males in the condition who thought they were going to have blood drawn were more attracted to females that they met than males in conditions where they did not think that they were going to have blood drawn. The classic study in this, though, has come to be known as the shaky bridge study, and I will talk about that in some detail next. The famous shaky bridge study was published in 1974 by a couple of researchers named Dutton and Aaron. The subjects in this study were male tourists who were alone on a bridge over the Capilano River in British Columbia, just outside of the city of Vancouver. The bridge was 5 feet wide and it was 450 feet long. It was a suspension bridge, so when you walk across it, it had a tendency to tilt and sway and wobble, and it gives you the impression that at any moment you're about to be pitched over the side to be dashed to death on the rocks 230 feet below. I've actually been on this bridge. It's pretty cool. Anyway, they were on this bridge and they were approached by either an attractive female experimenter or a male experimenter. Presumably, for most of the males in the study, the female would be a more appropriate person to feel romantic attraction toward. There was a control group of subjects that were interviewed on a sturdy bridge that was only 10 feet above the river. You could drive a car over it. So there was a bigger, sturdier, lower bridge across the same river, and that's where the control subjects were. So they were approached by this experimenter, and they were asked to tell a story in response to a TAT card. They thought that they were in a study on the effects of being in beautiful natural surroundings on creative expression. So they were looking at a picture and telling a story about the picture, and supposedly the experimenters were interested in how the story would be affected by the scenery. I'll tell you what a TAT card's all about soon. Here's what a TAT card looks like. TAT stands for Thematic Apperception Test. It's a test that's used in studies on motivation and personality. And basically people look at black and white pictures of individuals, and it's very ambiguous about what's going on in the picture, and people have to tell a story about what's happening. Anyway, they looked at one of these TAT cards, and curiously enough, what the researchers found was the subjects on the suspension bridge that was tilting and they were up real high told stories that had a much more sexually themed plot than subjects who were on the low bridge, but only when they were talking to a female experimenter. So that was a very telling thing, but that was not the main result of the study. The experimenters also gave them a phone number, meaning the subjects, so that later on, if they had questions about the experiment, they could call the experimenter up and talk to them. And as you can see from this graph, the subjects who were interviewed by the female on the arousing bridge were much more likely to make a phone call to her later on than the subjects on the arousing bridge who talked to a male or to any of the subjects on the control bridge. So this was evidence for the fact that A person with high arousal levels encountering an individual that they presumably could feel some romantic attraction toward are more likely to do that. And there have been many other less dramatic studies that show the same thing. In some studies, they have subjects come into the laboratory and exercise, run in place for a couple of minutes, and then express attraction toward stimulus people. And sure enough, when arousal levels are higher, people are more likely to express romantic attraction. So think about this effect. Next time you see a movie, this is kind of a standard plot, where you have two people who don't really seem to like each other very much, but they go through some harrowing, death-defying experience together, and sure enough, they fall madly in love as a result of this. It seems like somebody out there in Hollywood understands this adrenaline makes the heart grow fonder effect. Human beings don't seem to be the only animal that gets more strongly attached to things when their arousal levels are high. There's something known as imprinting. Baby chickens and ducks and geese and many other kinds of animals that move around very quickly right after birth strongly attach themselves to the first prominent moving thing that they see, and usually that's their mother. So when you see these geese swimming behind their mother on the lake, they are imprinted on her. They don't let her out of their sight. They follow her everywhere. In the other picture, we see Konrad Lorenz, who was a famous animal behavior researcher, who imprinted goslings on himself, and they followed him everywhere he went, which I guess could be kind of annoying. Anyway, you can increase the strength of imprinting in young animals by increasing their arousal levels. So if you're imprinting a baby duck on a football, on a roller skate, for example, and dragging it around, if you administer electric shocks to the duckling or create obstacles that make it harder for the duck to follow, the imprinting that takes place is even stronger. So let's now turn our attention to the attempts that psychologists have made to actually measure this thing we call love. And I'm going to focus on 4 different measures. Rubin's liking and loving scales, which was the first. He was the real pioneer. Then a couple of others that are pretty popular, and I'll get to those on subsequent slides. But I'll begin with the research done by Zick Rubin. Rubin did his research in the late 1960s, and he was the very first one who tried to measure love as something different from liking. I won't bore you with all the details of how one has to put together a psychological scale and all the statistical steps that you go through, but just trust me when I say it's pretty rigorous. You can't just randomly throw a bunch of questions together and say, well, there's my scale, I know it works. But Rubin went through all the necessary steps, put his scales together, and then had to do a study to validate them. If you have a scale that measures liking and a scale that measures loving, they should tell you different things. So I'll describe his first validation study. It was done at the University of Michigan, and they put up a sign advertising for dating couples. So you had to be a dating couple to participate, and both members of the couple had to show up for the study. And they were offering everybody $1 a piece to participate. So when you do a study like this, you get as many questionnaires printed up as you think you need, and just hope that enough people show up to use them. Well, on the night that they were going to do this study, they were ready for 182 couples, But when they showed up for the experiment, more than 400 couples showed up to participate, and they were lined up way down the campus, and they had to turn a lot of people away. So what Rubin did was to have each member of the couple fill out the love scale and the liking scale twice. Once they filled it out the way they would fill it out for their romantic partner. Another time they filled it out for their same-sex friend. So each member of the couple filled out the 2 scales twice. This is a sample of what some of the questions from Rubin's loving and liking scale look like. There would be a statement like, I feel that blank is a very stable person. and you would fill in the blank with the name of the person you're thinking of when you're filling the scale out. And in this experiment, half of the time it was the romantic partner, then the other time you filled it out, it was for your same-sex friend. And what they did was to measure the extent of their agreement on a 9-point scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The scales were longer than this. These are just some sample questions. So on the love scale, I feel strong feelings of possessiveness toward blank. I like it when blank confides in me. I would do almost anything for blank. And notice that these are different than the items on the liking scale. Well, they found that the two scales did in fact seem to be measuring different things. When you asked people what the estimates were that they would actually get married to each other, their estimates were more highly correlated with the love scale than with the liking scale. When they asked the subjects to report on the questionnaire if they thought they were in love with the person that they were now dating, the correlation was much higher with the loving scale and with the liking scale. Some follow-up studies by other people showed that high scores on the loving scale predicted more eye contact between members of a couple, but high scores on the liking scale did not. Also, kind of as a sidelight, the scores of males went up on the love scale but not the liking scale after they'd been exposed to pornography. Rubin's study was something of a sensation. It was the first time anybody had actually tried to measure love as something different from liking, and that prompted many other researchers to start thinking about the question of love and starting to ask, well, are there different styles of love? One of the more popular love models that came after this was something proposed by a couple of researchers named Hendrick and Hendrick, and they developed something called the love attitude scale to measure different kinds of love. According to Hendrick and Hendrick, there are 6 different styles of love. Eros. Eros is romantic, passionate love. It's driven by the other person's physical appearance. It's really about lust, actually. Ludus, which is love as an interpersonal game. Ludus love is sort of this game where you're playing cat and mouse with the partner, and it's exciting, and it's all about, in some ways, the manipulation of the other person. Storge is love that's growing out of affection and long-term friendship. This is kind of liking that very slowly turns into loving. The similarity between the people matters, and it grows over time. Pragma is pragmatic love, called shopping list love in this slide. It's a love relationship that's kind of based on a rational decision. Two people decide that they make a good couple and that there are all kinds of rational reasons why they should be together. And that's what that kind of love would be described as. Mania is highly emotional, romantic infatuation. It's this roller coaster where you find yourself thinking about the person and daydreaming about them and wondering if they're thinking about you. When you think about teenage crushes that people may have on celebrities or somebody that they barely know, that might describe mania. Agape is a much more spiritual love. You genuinely, selflessly care so much about another person that you want only what is good for them, even if that means they're not going to be with you. The instrument that Hendrick and Hendrick developed to measure these different styles of love is something called the love attitude scale. The love attitude scale is much longer than what you see on this slide. These are just a sampling of some of the questions. And if you look at them closely, you can probably figure out which ones go with which styles of love, which ones have to do with mania, which ones have to do with storge, which ones have to do with eros. Another popular model of love is Sternberg's triangular model of love. If you look at the points of the triangle, you've got three different kinds of love. There's intimacy, based on liking and just being close to another person. There's commitment, where you are bound to be with this individual. You've made a commitment, but there's not a whole lot of anything else going on, just commitment. Passion is an infatuation. It's just this obsession with a person. And then you've got combinations of these things. Romantic love would combine passion and intimacy. Companionate love would combine intimacy and commitment. Fatuous love is passion plus commitment. And consummate love, of course, is the best of all because it combines all of these different components. To give you some examples of how these different ones might work, think of passion alone as being the kind of love that would happen with somebody who they just met each other, they fell head over heels in love, they don't have much of a history together, they don't know each other very well, but they're very, very excited about each other's company for the short term. Companionate love, on the other hand, the intimacy plus commitment love, would perhaps be an older married couple who've been together forever. They have a lot of intimacy, they deeply care about each other, and they have a commitment to staying together forever. But maybe the passion has cooled after many decades together. Sternberg has also developed a questionnaire to measure these different styles of love, and the pattern of your scores on these various scales are the things that help classify what type of love you're experiencing. It's fun to think about all of these different styles of love and to speculate about how they might be different from each other, but I think for the purposes of this course, the main distinction to be made is between passionate love and companionate love. Passionate love being the one that includes that physical ingredient, all those biological markers that we talked about earlier on. Companionate love, depending more on intimacy and caring, less on the chemical stuff that's going on inside the brain. And of course, we actually have a scale that will also measure passionate love. So there's no shortage of love scales out there. And if the last picture was a photograph of passionate love, this one maybe represents companionate love. And I don't want to conclude a discussion of love without talking a little bit about the romantic ideal. Certain kinds of love, especially passionate love, are more likely to happen when people adhere to romantic ideals. There's even a scale to measure such a thing. For example, if a person agrees with statements like this, a person should marry whomever he loves, regardless of social position. Or, as long as they love one another, two people should have no trouble getting along in a marriage. Those are romantic ideal statements. If you endorse those, you are a hopeless romantic. On the other hand, if you agree with these questions, economic security should be carefully considered before selecting a marriage partner, or one should not marry against the serious advice of one's parents. If you endorse those items, you are not quite so romantic. You're a little more calculating and realistic. Now, the stereotype, of course, is that women are more romantic than men, but the research does not bear that out. Men score higher than women on these measures of adherence to the romantic ideal, and women are much more stringent than men about requirements for partners. Whether you're talking about race, religion, social status, what have you, women are simply more discriminating than men. Men report being much more satisfied after blind dates than women are, and twice as many men as women report being very easily attracted to members of the opposite sex. Also, men are more likely than women to report that they were very strongly attracted to their fiancé the first time they met them. The old love at first sight phenomenon seems to be much more of a male thing than a female thing. So when you put all that together, it may be that men, in fact, do adhere to the romantic ideal more than women do.